7. Federal Indian Boarding School System Framework. Past experience goes far to prove that it is cheaper to educate our wards than make war on them, or let them grow up in ignorance, to say nothing of the humanity of the act or the results attained. Federal records document that the United States considered the federal Indian boarding school system a central part of its Indian assimilation policy. The department has described the role of Indian assimilation policy coupled with the Indian land dispossession policy as follows. The essential feature of the government's great educational program for the Indians is the abolition of the old tribal relations and the treatment of every Indian as an individual. The basis of this individualization is the breaking up of tribal lands into allotments to the individuals of the tribe. This step is fundamental to the present Indian policy of the government. Until their lands are allotted, the government is merely marking time in dealing with any groups of Indians. The department has stated it was indispensably necessary that the Indians be placed in positions where they can be controlled and finally compelled by stern necessity to resort to agricultural labor or starve. Later adding that, if it be admitted that education affords the true solution to the Indian problem, then it must be admitted that the boarding school is the very key to the situation. Indeed, the department early on concluded that Indian boarding schools go further towards securing U.S. borders from bloodshed and keeping peace among the Indians themselves and attaching them to us than would the physical force of our army if employed exclusively towards the accomplishment of those objectives. Federal records indicate that the United States viewed official disruption to the Indian family unit as part of federal Indian policy to assimilate Indian children. The love of home and the warm reciprocal affection existing between parents and children are among the strongest characteristics of the Indian nature. When the department requested the Brookings Institution to study the economic and social condition of American Indians, the resulting Merriam Report found in 1928 that the main disruption to the Indian family and the tribal relations had come from the federal Indian boarding school system. On the whole, government practices may be said to have operated against the development of wholesome Indian family life. Chief of these is the long-continued policy of educating the Indian children in boarding schools far from their homes, taking them from their parents when small and keeping them away until parents and children become strangers to each other. The theory was once held that the problem of the Indian could be solved by educating the children, not to return to the reservation, but to be absorbed one by one into the white population. This plan involved the permanent breaking of family ties, but provided for the children a substitute for their own family life by placing them in good homes of whites for vacations and sometimes longer, the so-called outing system. The plan failed. Partly it was weak on the vocational side, but largely by reason of its artificiality. Nevertheless, this worst of its features still persists, and many children today have not seen their parents or brothers and sisters in years. The Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative sheds a new light on how the Federal Indian Boarding School system produced intergenerational trauma by disrupting family ties in Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and the Native Hawaiian community. A significant outcome of deliberate federal disruption to the Indian family unit through removal of Indian children from their Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages to off-reservation Indian boarding schools is that, depending on location, Indian children experienced the federal Indian boarding school system alongside other Indian children from the same and different Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages. The federal government accordingly devised artificial communities of Indian children throughout the federal Indian boarding school system, resulting in the creation of other Indian families and extended families, depending on whether an Indian child returned to the child's own Indian tribe or Alaska Native village, or located elsewhere after completing education in a federal Indian boarding school. For example, in 1886, Haskell Institute, Kansas, instituted a stricter form of discipline than heretofore prevailed by establishing a cadet battalion organization of 5 companies to break up the tribal associations. Size of cadets and not their tribal relations, determining now place in dormitory and mess hall, also necessitates a more frequent recourse to the English language as a common medium by bringing pupils of different tribes into closer contact. In that year alone, the Institute intentionally mixed Indian children from 31 different Indian tribes to disrupt tribal relations and discourage or prevent Indian language use across the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Cherokee, Chippewa, Comanche, Caddo, Delaware, Iowa, Kiowa, Kickapoo, Kaw, Mojave, Muncie, Modoc, Miami, New York, Omaha, Ottawa, Osage, Pawnee, Potawatomi, Ponca, Peoria, Quapaw, Seneca, Sac, and Fox, Seminole, Shawnee, Sioux, and Wyandot children. The department acknowledged that intermarriage by the young graduates of different nations would necessitate the use of the English language, which their offspring would learn as their mother tongue. Federal Indian law and policy accounts for Indians that are 1. From a single Indian tribe or Alaska Native village, 2. Multi-tribal, 3. Alaska Native Corporation shareholders, 4. Reservation-based, 5. Urban-based, 6. Other Indian families, 7. Extended families, 8. Terminated, 9. Descendant, and 10. Otherwise statutorily determined, various political and legal classifications that result in part from the federal Indian boarding school system. The United States has, for nearly 2 centuries, consistently recognized that Indian boarding schools comprised a system for Indian education. Indian schools must train the Indian youth of both sexes to take upon themselves the duties and responsibilities of citizenship. To do this requires a system of schools and an organization capable of preparing the Indian young people to earn a living either among their own people or away from the reservation homes and in competition with their white brethren. This contemplates a practical system of schools with an essentially vocational foundation. The Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigation at this stage did not examine the Federal Indian Day School System, the precursor education system to the Federal Indian Boarding School System. To analyze the Federal Indian Boarding School System in this report, the department notes that in the past it has described that day school instruction is the initial and most important element in the education of the Indian. To the day school, the Indian comes fresh from the teepee and finds himself at once amid new and strange surroundings. Federal Indian day schools were primarily located on Indian reservations and did not have a housing component for children directly on site with the education institution. Indian day schools have in nearly every instance preceded the boarding school, and in many cases been established through the benevolent efforts of missionaries or the wives of army officers stationed at military reservations in the Indian country. Still, the department has underscored that only by complete isolation of the Indian child from his savage antecedents can he be satisfactorily educated, and the extra expense attendant thereon is more than compensated by the thoroughness of the work. To operate the Federal Indian Boarding School System, the federal government supported schools with a housing component directly on site with the education institution. The federal government applied several approaches of Indian education that differed by federal resources provided, location type, including on and off Indian reservations, operator type, and education program type. The department in the past has classified Indian boarding schools that included those that were located on Indian reservations and controlled by agents, run independently, supported by general appropriation, supported by special appropriation, contract schools, supported by general appropriation, supported by special appropriation, mission schools established and chiefly supported by religious associations. The department has documented that off-reservation federal Indian boarding school representatives were allowed to select children from those attending reservation schools. The effect has been, in many instances, to demoralize the latter by selecting the brightest and best pupils, and in some instances to take children that might have been educated at home with little expense to the government. Federal Indian boarding schools were funded by annual appropriations from Congress, but also received resources from other sources as well. For the purposes of this report, the department identified a number of different sources of funding for the operation of federal Indian boarding schools. Appropriations made under the educational provisions of existing Indian treaties, funded investments of bonds and other securities held by the United States, proceeds of the sale of lands of certain Indian tribes, accumulations of money in the treasury resulting from the sale of lands, annual appropriations by U.S. Congress for Indian school purposes. Based upon these sources, it is apparent that proceeds from cessions of Indian territories to the United States through treaties, which were often signed under duress, were used to fund the operation of federal Indian boarding schools. As a result, the United States assimilation policy, the federal Indian boarding school system, and the efforts to acquire Indian territories are connected. The United States used monies resulting from Indian wealth depletion from cessions of territories and held in federal trust accounts for Indian tribes to pay for the attempted assimilation process of Indians. As Congress has found, a large proportion of the expense for the operation of the schools came from Indian treaty funds and not federal appropriations. For example, between 1845 and 1855, while over $2 million was spent on the federal Indian boarding school system, federal appropriations accounted for only 1/20th, or $10,000 per year of the sum, with the Indian Trust Fund monies supplying the rest. In addition, concerning the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 alone, which turned territories from collective Indian ownership into individual Indian land allotments, Congress determined, however intended, the actual result of the law were a diminishing of the Indian tribal economic base from 140 million acres to approximately 50 million acres, and severe social disorganization of the Indian family. Congress further concluded that the Dawes Act's land policy was directly related to the government's Indian education policy because proceeds from the destruction of the Indian land base were used to pay the costs of taking Indian children from their homes and placing them in federal boarding schools, a system designed to dissolve the Indian social structure. The amount of tribal or individual Indian trust fund account monies, if any, held in trust by the United States and used to directly support the federal Indian boarding school system is currently unknown. In 1908, the Supreme Court ruled in Quickbear v. Sloop that the United States could use monies held in treaty and trust fund accounts for Indian territories ceded to the United States to fund children induced or compelled to attend Indian boarding schools that were operated by religious institutions or organizations. While payments to religious institutions and organizations depleted funds Indian tribes were entitled to, the court held that the prohibition on the federal government to spend funds on religious schools did not apply to Indian treaty funds, did not violate Indian Appropriations Acts, and to forbid such expenditures would violate the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. Although individual federal Indian boarding schools varied by operation, management, and funding, together they comprised a federally recognized system.